let's go ahead and get started. We all know this Chevron deference. When you work on Capitol Hill, for much of my career, Chevron deference was a boogeyman. And the end of Chevron deference was something that you could only wish for. And then one day in 2024, all of a sudden, Chevron deference is now over. And this is the Loper-Bright case, the Supreme Court's case that overturned the Chevron doctrine or precedent from 1984. And that obviously is going to have massive repercussions. And we're here to talk about those repercussions. And we're here to build on a symposium between FAI and the Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia School of Law. And we have a distinguished panel here. I wrote down your biographies so I wouldn't mess it up. We have Adam White here at the end. He's the executive director of the Gray Center and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And he is an expert on all things administrative law. We have Kevin Kosar.
It's even more glamorous than it sounds.
I like rules, congressional procedure, and you managed to take something and make it even nerdier than that. So good for you. It makes me feel good about myself. And then we have Kevin Kosar, who basically invented Congress. We all know Kevin. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He runs the Understanding Congress website and Understanding Congress blog, and he has been doing congressional capacity since the beginning of time. So we're here, and we're glad you're here with us. And then we have Paul Ray, who was he's the acting director of the Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and served in various leadership roles at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, including as administrator during Trump's first term. So he actually did stuff. I was a congressional staffer, and you actually made things happen. So this is going to be good.
It's good to be here. Does that work?
So you have to hit the button, though. This is the congressional staffer.
There we go. Look at that. Look at that. Well, it's great to be here. I actually don't know anything at all about Congress, which is interesting to be talking on a panel about Congress.
I don't think you're supposed to say that.
Oh shoot! I always forget. Yeah. So anyway, I'm excited to learn from folks more knowledgeable than I, and then share the fruit of my experience in the executive for Congress.
Paul, you're supposed to look them in the eye, speak in complete sentences, and just be confident. That's what Tom Coburn taught me.
Well, when you put it that way.
But I want to turn over to Adam, who's been involved in this project for much longer than I have, just to say a few words before we get started in our program here.
Thanks. And the first thing I want to say is a word of thanks to James over there, because I run this center, the Center for the Study of the Administrative State. There's a lot of words in that name. And there's always a 50-50 chance that my introducer will introduce me as running the Center for the Administrative State. Then I have to say, no, that's actually at Yale. That's very, very different. But also just very, very grateful to FAI for organizing tonight's event, but also for organizing this series of policy briefs. Between my own work at AEI and the work I do at the Boyden Gray Center, we get to work with a lot of great scholars and a lot of great organizations. I've never worked with a group that runs something as well as FAI. I've been a fan of the program since the very beginning, back when it was called Lincoln Labs or the Lincoln Network, not the Lincoln Project. But and watching its rise has been amazing, and watching everything that's happened under Zach's leadership has just been really incredible. So
this is why we invited you, Adam.
Thank you. But also grateful for all of you to be here tonight. The papers are important. I hope you'll take 2 copies, not just so that we don't have to truck them home ourselves, but so that you can hand one off to somebody else who needs to read it. This is an incredibly important moment at the intersection of the Supreme Court and Congress. These cases that the court is hearing right now about the administrative state, they're about agencies, but they're mostly about Congress. In the background of all these cases is a question of what's Congress's role in government today? What was it built to do? But also, what is it capable of doing today? And I'll circle back to this later, but a lot is at stake in future cases in the aftermath of Chevron deference, and not just on the stuff we'll talk about tonight, cases about the non-delegation doctrine and other things. The court is poised to make enormous changes in the way the administrative state works. The lower courts are poised to make enormous changes, but a lot of it hinges on how much faith judges have in Congress to actually be capable of making and remaking laws and contributing their role to the constitutional system. It requires a lot of things, as Kevin will say, a lot of capacity in Congress. It's going to require learning or relearning just the basic muscle memory of a legislative process. But so much hinges on it generationally. We've not seen a moment like this since literally 100 years ago, when the Supreme Court and the Roosevelt administration fundamentally rethought not just the rules that govern the administrative state, but the basic narrative about what all of this government is about. We are at a moment like that, something we haven't seen in a century, and there's a great opportunity for us to help the courts and Congress move towards a government that isn't just centered around the administrative state. But so much of it hinges on the experiment that the Supreme Court is embarking on right now, first and foremost by undoing Chevron deference. So that really is what's at stake in this. I'll offer a little bit more commentary later, but I don't want to filibuster. I want to say, lastly, I'm grateful to all of the authors who contributed to this book, this series of papers. They're really, really great. And first and foremost among them is Paul Ray's contribution to this. I sometimes joke he does so many programs with the Gray Center. We should just rename it the C. Boyden Gray Center for Paul Ray's study of the administrative state. But the work he's done, not just focusing on his old office at OIRA, but really thinking about the philosophical underpinnings of all of this, how we think about administrative expertise, how we should think about Congress's expertise. There's nobody else doing what he's doing right now, and I'm just so glad that he was part of it. And maybe can I turn things over to Paul now to say a few words?
Absolutely.
All right, well, great to, yes, let's applaud. So great to be here. How many of you are congressional staffers? Okay. How many of you work in the executive branch? Law clerks? What do the rest of you guys do?
How many of you want to be congressional staffers?
We're going to start here and go around the room one by one.
Yeah, exactly. Tell us where you're from. No, just curious what experiences you guys have. So what I want to do is talk about a couple things. I want to talk about the reasons for the common assertion that the executive knows so much more than Congress does. I want to test those reasons. And then I want to take as the fruit of that conversation, ways we might help Congress to know more. And I'm going to do that by drawing on what I know best, maybe all that I know, which is my experience at OIRA. Has anyone read Cass Sunstein's great article, "The Most Knowledgeable Branch"? You guys, some of you have read that. Yeah, I think it's a great article. It's very thoughtful. Cass makes the argument basically. It's a common argument, but I think he makes it probably best. That there's just no way for any other actor in the government to compete with the executive branch in terms of knowledge. That's for a few reasons. The executive branch is just way bigger than the other two branches. Orders of magnitude more staff. Those staff, many of them have spent their entire lives studying the particular problems they're working on. Many of them have spent their entire careers running particular programs and developing expertise from sort of hands-on experience. And he says it's kind of crazy to think that with all those advantages, anyone else in government, Congress or the courts, could hope to duplicate executive branch knowledge, specialized knowledge. And while specialized knowledge isn't all you need to make good rules, it's one thing you need to make good rules, and often enough, it's all that you effectively need to make good rules. So what in some ways, my paper is a response to this argument, not just Cass's argument, but the broader argument of which his article is kind of an exemplar, which is that that the executive branch just knows a lot more than everybody else, and that's a reason to defer to them in rulemaking in many cases. The reason I think the argument doesn't hold up, well, there's a few reasons I think it doesn't hold up. One main reason is that the things the executive branch knows need to be shareable to be given effect. Well, let me unpack what I mean by that. If you're not feeling well and you go to the doctor, you can say to the doctor, what's wrong with me? And he could tell you. But you could just say, what should I do to feel better? And he could tell you. And then you could go and do what he said, right? And maybe you feel better. you could do that without the doctor sharing any of his medical knowledge whatsoever with you, right? The reason is because the doctor is a single person, or AI, I don't know. No, we're not there yet, thankfully. A single person with a single mind and will. And so he doesn't have to give reasons to anyone to give you advice. He can just think in his own mind, relying on his body of knowledge about your symptoms, and then think out what would make you feel better, and then tell you what to do, right? Same is true more or less with all kinds of other specialized professions. What I want to stress is that it's not at all true for agencies. The reason is that agencies are, we might call them entities of order rather than substances, right? For those of you who are Thomistically inclined in the room, right? Agencies are groups of people. They aren't super persons, right? They don't have a mind. They don't have a will. Anytime an agency thinks something, it's because a person in the agency thinks it. Anytime an agency decides something, it's because a person in the agency decides it, right? And what that means is that the people who make the decisions, who cause things to happen, are very, very often not the people who have the special knowledge. What I'm building to is the proposition that administration runs on expertise sharing. Subject matter experts in agencies have to share their special knowledge with their superiors and the political leadership of the agency, and then with OIRA and the policy councils in the White House and DOJ, which helps prepare rules for defense and litigation, all kinds of other executive branch actors for that specialized knowledge to flow into action. Let me just give you an example. Let's say there's a I don't know, a regulation governing auto fuel standards. Now, there's a lot of specialized knowledge that goes into that regulation, but also it has to be signed off on by political leadership, both in the agency and the White House. And political leadership is not likely to say, you experts, you just tell us what we should do and we'll do it. It's fine. No, of course not. They're going to be held accountable to the public before Congress and in the courts and for the public opinion for the action. So they're going to want to know about the knowledge that underlies the staff's recommendation. And so the staff have to find a way to communicate that knowledge. I'm here basically summarizing a point I make very briefly in this paper, but more length with another paper with the Gray Center, a longer paper. The point is this: whatever knowledge agencies have, they put into effect. At least for the most important consequential actions, it tends to be the kind of knowledge that can be shared, and we can know this because it tends to be in fact shared to be given effect. All right, now let's think about Congress. There are many reasons to think that Congress's in-house expertise both is and is likely to remain far deficient to the executive branches. Some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, in fact, are the reasons for thinking that. But Congress doesn't have to rely just on its in-house expertise. It can tap into the agencies. Again, there are reasons to be optimistic about its ability to do that because agency expertise that's operative is also tends to be shareable. So the main thrust of this paper is inquiring how well set up Congress is now to access agency expertise, and what are ways that it could become better set up to access agency expertise. And to assess that question, I compared Congress's relationship to the agencies to OIRA's. Because in my experience, OIRA does a pretty darn good job about accessing agency expertise. Not a perfect job, I'm sure, but pretty darn good. And so I wanted to see what we could learn from how OIRA accesses agency expertise for Congress. So in brief, and I know my time is running short already. So just in brief, the first, there are 5 things or 5 qualities, or facts, I guess is a better word, that make OIRA effective at accessing agency expertise. First, OIRA staff are themselves experts. They don't have the same expertise or as deep expertise as the agencies, but they are themselves experts, which means they can ask intelligent questions of agency experts and understand the responses that agency experts give. It's not like, I don't know, me quizzing my doctor, right? Second, OIRA staff can draw on public comments to help them ask the right questions, right? They don't have to start from square one. They have a docket of often very robust public comments to inform their inquiries to agency staff. Third, agency staff have good incentives to share information with OIRA. After all, agencies want the rules to get signed off by OIRA, and OIRA, if it doesn't feel it's gotten an adequate briefing from the agency, can decline to do that. Fourth, OIRA and agencies are repeat players vis-a-vis each other. While OIRA's reg review function is only a product of an executive order, there's every reason to believe that executive order will be here until doomsday, since it's been embraced by both Republicans and Democrats for the last 3 decades. So agencies have a reason to think that OIRA is here for the long term and reasons to cultivate, therefore, good relationships with OIRA. And fifth, OIRA and agencies can talk to each other in private. Many aspects of OIRA review are public. The rules that are under review, the private parties who come in to meet with OIRA, but the conversations themselves and for the most part, even written communications between the agency and OIRA are private, and that allows airing of views that's not distorted by the need to grandstand. All right, so let's look at Congress now. Now, I was serious when I said earlier I don't really know anything at all about Congress. So the comparison here is informed by the scholarly literature on Congress, but I'm going to learn a lot from everyone else up here and from you, some of you all about Congress. So first, Congress, like OIRA, has the benefit of expert staff, many fewer than the executive branch, but that's again true of OIRA, and OIRA does just fine. So we might think that Congress, even with its expertise disparity, has the expertise it needs to at least ask the right questions of the agencies and understand their answers. But some people argue, I'll take it as true, that expertise has declined in Congress among congressional staff over the years, in recent years. And so if in fact that's the case, well, certainly Congress could probably make itself better off by rebuilding its expertise, which would allow it to better access or better ask the right questions and understand the answers given in response. And I talk in the paper a little bit about how that might be done, but I'm not going to stop here on it. Second, Congress has access to public input, like OIRA has access to public comments. In fact, some of the same people who comment, some of the same industries and trade associations, et cetera, who comment on rulemakings and thus give OIRA the benefit of their comments, send letters and submit studies to members of Congress. There's an important difference, which is that OIRA has access to a kind of one-stop shop for all public comments, whereas private actors may send their studies just to particular members who they think are favorable to them, and that could be a sensible strategy. But often people would want, all staffs or all members to be able to draw on their body of data, and so one way that could help Congress access expertise in a way a little more like OIRA's is to have basically a docket opened for pending legislation for people to submit comments and studies into. Third, agency staff, generally speaking, have incentives to share their expertise with Congress to prevent the passage of bad legislation. But if Congress is concerned that the incentives aren't quite aligned properly, it could always dock the budgets of agencies who fail to respond to congressional inquiries adequately. Fourth, congressional committees and agencies are repeat players vis-a-vis each other, but they could be made more so if agency staff were a little more durable. For instance, if the change between the numbers of minority and majority staff were less stark. And fifth, it may be that the most glaring difference, I'm not sure about this, it may be that the most glaring difference is that, of course, congressional hearings are absolutely publicity events in a way that meetings with OIRA are not. But of course, it would be wrong to think that congressional testimony, hearings are where most information is shared. There's all kinds of opportunities to communicate privately with members of Congress. though it is true that in eras of divided government, any interaction between an agency controlled by one party and a committee staff of another can be very fraught. So if there could be some sort of norm established about preserving the privacy of communications in even that scenario between agencies and congressional staff and members, that could make a serious contribution to helping Congress access agency expertise. And with that, I yield the floor.
So, yep. So I think Kevin is, Mr. Congressional Capacity here. As Paul has identified, there's clearly an opportunity for Congress in this post-Chevron world to reassert itself. And on paper, at least, it makes sense that it can reassert itself. Now, I guess the question, and for you, and obviously take it wherever you want, is what are the challenges to Congress doing that? It's not loaded at all.
Where to begin? Well, thank you, James, for that. Bartender. So, it's interesting. When we talk about policymaking, I think those of us who, show up to events like this, we're not the average American. We're people who often have some sort of knowledge of deep knowledge of governance. Maybe we've been trained in policy analysis or public administration or something like that. So ultimately, we're kind of focused on ultimately policy should be rational, it should be effective, it should be this, it should be that. And that's just an operating presupposition we have. And, that presupposition is important, but at the same time, it somehow sits a little uneasily with the idea of representative government, which is you should to some degree represent what the people want, even if that means making policy that's a mishmash of compromise that doesn't really hang together in an entirely coherent way. Ultimately, congressional government is based on the premise that it hopefully is going to be more stable over the long term, and it will get popular consent. People will not rebel against it and feel that it is inherently illegitimate. Yet, 100 years ago, we kind of, as we scaled up government, started to do a little bit of a division of labor, where it became, we're Congress, we're going to kind of pass the law, but you, the executive branch, can kind of fill in the blanks. And if you do a good job of it, we'll let it go, we'll claim credit on our behalf. You do a bad job of it, we're going to hoot at you and throw rocks and kind of complain about the administrative state. And that division of labor, I think, is to largely, it continues to this day. I've been in this town for 22 years now, worked with tons of congressional staff, members of Congress, and they have got a lot of responsibilities. And it's relatively rare to find people on Capitol Hill who are leaning in even half time in their work hours on regulatory issues. They just have so much else to do. So that division of labor is out there, and it just creates this dynamic. And it's a dynamic that's just kind of constitutionally problematic. I mean, go back to what does the Grand Charter say? Well, Article 2, one of the things it says is that the executive should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, guess what? The executive is working on behalf of the legislature with money appropriated by the legislature. So how in God's green earth is Congress supposed to know if they are taking care that the law be faithfully executed? Well, it's through oversight. Well, who wants to do that? It's hard work. It takes a lot of time. And on regulatory matters, it's complicated because you do have agencies, and there's this principal-agent relationship between people who pass the law and then people who execute it, of are they really doing what we want them to do? In Congress, it's 535 people, so that we gets really complicated. It's not like a manager just managing an employee. That's a way more complicated Capitol Hill principal-agent relationship. So it's a really complicated oversight problem, and Congress has not, I think, fully absorbed it. It still treats largely regulation as something that happens over there. Just let them fill in the blanks, and then, of course, we'll hoot about it. Maybe we'll pass a Congressional Review Act disapproval resolution if we're really mad. But generally, the administrative state is just going to do its thing, and we're going to keep shoveling money over to it. What I have been arguing is that, Congress does a lot of oversight stuff. I mean, 100 years ago, it created the General Accounting Office, which became the Government Accountability Office. 50 plus years ago, it created the Congressional Budget Office. The idea is that you hire people who help you do stuff that you're not actually expert enough to do on your own, more than likely, and which you just don't have enough bandwidth for. Create these shared services that can help you. Well, goodness, regulation is a way that a lot of policy gets made these days. I mean, we have a few thousand regulations make their way through the regulatory process each year. Congress, meanwhile, enacts maybe 50-ish statutes per year. I mean, a lot of lawmaking and policy making is happening over there. Well, why don't you Congress guys give yourself some help? I mean, one thing I have found in DC is that if you want work to get done, you got to assign people to do it. It's just that simple. Think back a few years ago when people were talking a lot about congressional reform. Well, nobody in Congress was really assigned to do that work. Happily, we created a modernization committee in the House. And guess what? People started doing that work because it was like, this is a job, do it. I think the same thing should be done by Congress when it comes to regulation. Members of Congress are insanely busy. They have an unbelievable number of duties, a growing number of constituents every year. They got to run for re-election relentlessly. There is so much going on. Hire some help. Get some nonpartisan people, tuck them in the Congressional Budget Office or some other place whose job it is to follow the regulatory process and to help Congress weigh in so that you can take care that the law be faithfully executed and stop agencies before they do something that's amok. And if I can just back up to one thing, going to something you were speaking of, which was the idea that the executive branch is this repository of expertise and that Congress, we're just amateurs, used car salesmen, lawyers, local country judges. We don't have any business telling them what to do. Well, number one, policy is never a value-free enterprise. There are always contesting values at stake, and how a law gets implemented really matters. Second, if the executive branch is just this pure repository of expertise, then why is it that every time we get a switch in party control of the White House, regulation gets jerked in one direction, and then the other, and then the other? Executive branch does have a lot of expertise, but it's inevitably in service of power, political power. And we just can't ignore that fact.
So Adam, this is your bailiwick. This is what you know.
Well, and I also
Give us
know,
the answer.
as the last speaker on the line, the faster I stop, the sooner people are going to get back to the bar. But let me just.
Oh no, we've got lots of questions coming after this.
I just want to put a fine point on what Kevin and Paul just said. Starting with Kevin, Congress needs to do more, but to do it, it needs more capacity. And it needs to assert itself more, not just over policy making, but over thinking about what makes good policy. Elsewhere, he's written about things like a congressional regulatory office to mirror OIRA in some ways, but really to serve Congress's own aims. And to Paul's point, Congress can learn sort of policy information from the administration. It can even learn sort of how to go about making good policy. But it's a fundamentally different kind of administration, or a fundamentally different kind of information. You know this, those of you that work on Capitol Hill, you understand that the information that goes into deciding whether to make policy or how to do oversight, it's not exclusively technocratic in the same way that the executive branch is. You're able to get good information from Congress, from the administration, or some administrations, but you do need to know what kind of information actually suits Congress's purposes. I just want to add to that, to say this is a timeless question in American government. I'll try not to go back too much to the founding fathers, but if I can't do that here, where can I do it? From the very outset, the government needed two kinds of information. You had the Washington administration with their people in far-flung places like the Port of Savannah or up in Boston. You had government spread across the eastern seaboard. And the people working in the Washington administration, they were able to give the president, Hamilton and others, information on what was working, what was not working, what was needed, but from the standpoint of administration. What does administration need in terms of resources or information or new laws? Congress finds another kind of information. Because when Congress isn't in Washington, when they're back with their constituents, they were getting a kind of information too about what was needed from the people. Congress is the place to really get information on what the people need from their government. Administration just can't get that same kind of information in the same way. They're not built for it. They can do notice and comment rulemaking. It's important, but more often than not, the administration already knows what it wants to do when it starts the process. It's looking for information to assist it in executing the job it already wants to do. It's only in Congress where you get the information from the people about what jobs really need to be done from the people's standpoint. And that's how I really want to tie together what Paul and Kevin said. Let me just make a couple marginal notes of my own. What's the upshot of what the Supreme Court just did in Loper Bright? Some of it goes to oversight, some of it goes to legislation. Oversight's more fun, I know, so let's just start with that. The Supreme Court's opened the door to a kind of judicial review of agency action that cares about whether the agency is just kind of making it up as it goes along, or is trying to build on what's done before for the sake of a little bit of learning and steadiness from one administration to the next. Right now, we have administration by flip-flop. And I'll admit, I like about 50% of the flip-flops. I like the flips, not the flops. And everybody can disagree about what those are. But the court right now wants stability. And you're not just seeing that in Loper Bright, you're seeing that in other cases. Here's what that means for oversight. Congress is uniquely well suited in oversight to dig out the information that the court is going to want to know about where a lot of these policies come from and about whether the administration, each administration, is building on what came before, sure, changing, making changes along the way, but the court cares more than it used to about continuity. And so on the policies that Congress cares about at any given moment in time, they're in a position to dig into an administration, unlike anybody else, unlike people who appear before the agencies or file FOIA requests and so on. The oversight committees now in the post-Chevron era are the ones best suited to challenge an agency, to demand information. Usually agencies get to choose what they want to talk about or do. Only the committees with oversight can challenge the agency, really sometimes force an agency to give them information about where a policy came from, not just in the last year, but the last 40 years. How much of this actually has precedence or not. To dig into that and to start to tell Congress's own narratives about these policies before you get to court and an administration says, yeah, this is a sweeping new policy to transform the energy sector through a clean power plan, but it's really not that new. There's been things like that before. Obviously, that's crazy. And the court cares more than ever that these unprecedented policies have no real roots beyond a current administration. But it's up to Congress and the committees of oversight to think ahead and think, what policies are we going to want to support or challenge in the future? And what information do we want from the agencies now before they create the next version of that policy? What story do we, Congress, and litigants who get information from congressional reports, what stories do we want to tell the Supreme Court and the lower courts about these policies? So oversight could be really transformed in the post-Loper Bright era in the kind of information you can get, or more specifically, the value attached to the kind of information that only Congress can get. But Loper Bright's also going to mean something for legislation. The Supreme Court is testing a theory of whether Congress can actually legislate. Legislate on substantive policies like updating our energy or environmental laws, or crafting entirely new legislative programs for things like AI. And in the next 10 years or so, if Congress doesn't actually live up to the challenge somewhat in legislating, it's going to give the next generation of the Supreme Court, which might look different, very different from the current court. It's going to give that next generation of the court a narrative about why Congress just can't legislate and why the executive branch, the administrative states, claims that only we can really make policy. It's either going to confirm that narrative or it's going to disprove that narrative. So I really hope Congress legislates. And it's why I really personally care, and it's not in the book, but it's why I care about the debates right now about funding. I was really, really glad to hear that the administration and DOJ are starting to warm up to the idea of using the Impoundment Act process rather than thwarting the Impoundment Act or just defying it altogether. I understand the Impoundment Act doesn't speak directly to what happens over the course of a couple of weeks or even a couple of months. But looking out over the course of 1 year or 2 years or beyond, this is an opportunity for the administration and Congress to show that they can use a legislative process to make change. And this is a process that's built for a moment like this, to actually fast track a legislative process. I've joked with Kevin in the office about ways we could make it look more interesting. Sometimes I think maybe President Trump should sign an Impoundment Act rescission letter, like in a big ceremony in the White House, and then Elon Musk could take it, or maybe it would be, who's the staff secretary? Will Scharf. Will could take it down to the south entrance of the White House, where a giant Cybertruck painted in red, white, and blue with a flag that says the MAGA Express could drive this letter 80 miles an hour down Pennsylvania, down Pennsylvania Avenue to Congress for Speaker Johnson to pick up. I don't care if it looks hilarious or ridiculous or what. We just need that metaphor to actually to exist. That the president can hand things off to Congress, and that Congress can legislate and make it its own. This is the most streamlined legislative process short of the Congressional Review Act. It's an enormous opportunity for Congress to relearn the muscle memory of how to legislate. And so I really hope Congress won't let that go to waste. The other thing, and this is a point that Kevin and Phil Wallach and Yuval Levin all write about at AEI, is this is an opportunity for committees to really play a role in the policymaking process again. The ideal Congress doesn't center all of its power in the leadership. No disrespect to Speaker Johnson's representatives here if he has any. And it's not even to centralize power in the individual members. No offense to folks who work for the members. That middle space of the committees is the place where Congress can do and be seen as doing important policymaking work. And so the future of legislating in the post-Chevron era really lies in the committees. The stakes are enormously high. Chevron, the Loper-Bright was a great decision, but the most important decisions yet to come are about the non-delegation doctrine. Should the court start striking down statutes that a century ago or even 15 years ago just delegated the legislative power to the administrative state? Who knows how that's going to go? There was a recent case involving the FCC. Trent McCotter, he gave an oral argument that was just amazing. His first Supreme Court oral argument, you'd think he's been doing his whole life. And even the conservative justices seem very wary of the idea of striking down a statute on non-delegation grounds. And I don't blame them for being wary. 40 years ago, when Justice Scalia was just lonely think tanker Scalia, he was wary of a non-delegation doctrine. He didn't want judicial activism. The justices, even the most well-intentioned justices among the textualists, they're very wary about asserting this power to strike down these delegations. And so they're going to have to be comfortable with the idea that Congress can come back and legislate again. So much rides on the next 10 years in terms of the next generation of Supreme Court decisions. But I want to say just one last thing. And it goes to why this is important, not just for Congress and the courts, but for execution itself. Like the potted narrative of the last 100 years is Congress delegates power to the administrative state because then the administrative state can go about making great rules. And really, only the administrative state can make rules on the fly. And now we have the Administrative Procedure Act and all these other laws that try to put limits on how, or procedures on how the agencies are going to legislate. Congress delegated enormous power to the agencies and then shackled them with tons of procedures because they have so much power. And so what we have now is a Congress that doesn't really legislate, and we have an administration that mostly legislates. Think about the last 4 months, the last 2 months, the biggest burst of energy in any administration. The Trump administration has focused overwhelmingly on what the new rules should be. The executive orders, soon we'll have notices of proposed rulemaking or interim final rules, whatever. We're in a flurry of lawmaking in the executive branch. And that's mostly what the executive branch does on big policies now. It's the lawmaker. Who actually executes the laws now? That's no small thing. Hamilton, one last throwback to the founding, when Hamilton was writing in the Federalist Papers, he said the most important thing for good government is swift, steady execution of the laws. That once Congress makes a law, you need quick, even-handed execution of the laws, or else the laws are just a dead letter. We're kind of living in Hamilton's nightmare right now because administration, having been delegated all this power, they have to spend most of their time thinking about what the rules should be with every new administration. All the executive orders, all the rulemakings and everything. They have to spend so much time thinking about the rules that they can't prioritize actually enforcing the laws. And by the time that the dust settles on whatever the new administration's new rules are, it's time for the lawsuits that freeze those rules, and then the next administration to come in and make all the rules afresh. And so while you think Congress delegates the power to the administration and that gives the administration too much power, that's true. But it also drains from the executive branch the power, or at least the opportunity, to do its actual job, which is to enforce laws that somebody else made. And so that's where we are now. We're with an administration, every administration is acting in lieu of Congress to make the rules, and then there's no one left to actually enforce the rules, except for district court judges and others who kind of act like 500 or really 24 mini executives in the course of the administration. That's what's at stake. It's not just making Congress a better version of itself, it's making administration the right version of itself. But it's only going to start with Congress and the Supreme Court and the lower courts actually putting the administration in its right box and creating space for Congress to do its job. And I just want to say one last thing, that there's so many good folks who are thinking about this. Lots of them don't publish in these slick papers, and this is actually a very slick paperback. I was stunned by how nice this is. So much of this is the hard work that's being done in Congress. Folks like Daniel Flores sitting in the back and others who are thinking about this, and Ethan Harper who came in late. I saw you leave earlier. That one of my favorite things about this book is that we were able to get Mike Fregoso, while he was wrapping up his service in Leader McConnell's office last year, to actually give his account of what might happen next. The accumulated knowledge inside of Congress, the folks who have been here for a long time, and the folks who are also coming afresh with some new perspectives. I'm lucky to spend enough time on the Hill to see you guys talk about these things, and I get to learn from you. But I think it's really important for folks who are able to, who are in a position on Capitol Hill or who are newly left from Capitol Hill, to speak about these things too, to actually explain to constituents or, God help us, the academics, to give them a dose of reality as to how these things actually work, what's possible, what's not really possible, and to be in a real dialogue with the think tanks and the academics. I think the Gray Center and AEI have both been a good transmission belt in both directions between practice and theory. And now is a time when that transmission belt is probably as important as ever. So once again, just really grateful to our speakers today, including Kevin, who was drafted in about 8 hours ago and Fregoso dropped out. The only thing I don't like about him today. But also just really grateful to FAI for organizing this event tonight.
No, absolutely. And thank you all for your comments. And I just wanted to ask one question, and we'll turn it over to the audience for any questions they have. And I'm going to do what I do. I'm going to push you a little bit. There's a lot of talk about Congress and what Congress can do. And I don't know, how many of you have read Huckleberry Finn? Anybody read Huckleberry Finn growing up? Yeah, most people read Huckleberry Finn, right? What do you notice about Huckleberry Finn every time you see a steamboat coming down the river? Anybody? It's bad news bears. It's like on fire. There are dead bodies floating around. It's sinking, right? It turns out steamboats are some of the first area that we started regulating. Right? And one of the things on the right, at least, when it comes to the administrative state, is that it's like, let's get rid of the administrative state. And I'm like, well, what about Huckleberry Finn? We're just going to let the steamboats just run rampant over everybody? Of course not. So it's not a very fruitful discussion. The discussion ought to be, what is the relationship between Congress and the administrative state? How do we best structure that relationship so that we can adhere to the principles of the Constitution, so that we can perpetuate American self-government, while at the same time reaping the benefits of regulation, of that knowledge, of that specialized knowledge. And that really is what we're looking at right now. And the question is, and I think there's a lot of fanfare around the Loper-Bright decision, that this is going to change everything. And so I just want to start off, and maybe I shouldn't do this, but this is what I'm going to do. It's like, why is it going to change everything? It's unclear to me that this Supreme Court decision is going to change anything. Right?
You and your constant campaigns against steamboats. I don't know what did the steamboats do to you in your childhood? One of you guys want to go first, or?
What is it about the current political incentives that would encourage members to take advantage of this opportunity?
Yeah. No, I mean, when read the Loper decision, what I saw was that the court said in those instances where we have a vague statutory provision, it's up in the air who's going to decide what the law ultimately means. No longer will we simply defer to the executive branch. So it creates an opportunity for somebody else to do that. That requires Congress to step forward and say, we actually want to do that. Otherwise, it's going to default to the courts. Will Congress actually want to do that? Will they want to lean in? It's not clear to me. I mean, the incentives pull in a whole lot of different directions. I mean, there are members who very clearly care about how the law is implemented, and they would like to see that the law is faithfully executed. But wishes are not work plans. And, I'm sorry, but, 20 plus years of being on Capitol Hill, like, we all have daily workflows. And how do you get the process of having a regular conversation with the executive branch as a legislator or a staffer working for a legislator or a committee to happen so that you are synced up, so that they're doing what you expect them to do? And if they're not doing, that you can perhaps thwart them in some way, shape, or form, or build a coalition in Congress that can lean in. There's just no place in process that creates those sort of relationships. It's very ad hoc. It's catch as catch can. And when you have an executive branch with 180 agencies, each of which can plop out rules, it's a massive job. And this is where I ultimately get bound to, like, you just need some help. You need to assign people to do this work who will be able to let you know, like, oh, hey, by the way, I mean, think about what inspector generals do. Think about what GAO does. You're not ordering them to plop out a report to audit this agency's finances. They're just going to do it because that's their job. And then they drop the report, and it's like, holy crap, this program is not working. It's wasting a lot of money. As a legislator, I'm like, oh, that forces me to think about that instead of the 25 other things that are on my head at that point in time. Same thing with regulation. If nobody's going to force you to think about that other than interest groups, Wall Street Journal op-eds, editorials, that sort of stuff, then the work is not going to get done. We can't just wag our fingers at legislators and say, you should do this. They're not going to. Some will, but you can't wag your fingers and expect this sort of moralistic response of, oh yes, I'll set aside time from raising money for my reelection campaign, and I'll skip these party meetings that I have to go to, and I won't do these constituent service stuff so I can do good oversight. That is expecting too much of our legislators, and I think our founders would laugh if we talked about that. In which case, unless you're going to shrink the executive branch down to something very, very small that's only plopping out 50 rules a year that your average member will have time to weigh in on, you just got to have to build capacity. And it's going to have to nudge, the capacity itself will nudge Congress to pay attention. And whether they actually do something or not, who's to say? That doesn't mean that we don't need the capacity. If we're going to have any chance at wrapping our heads around the administrative state and making it more accountable to the public, then we just got to need the legislative muscle to get it there.
Paul, you have a unique vantage point on this as at OIRA, right? How, from your perspective, could you encourage Congress to take advantage of the kind of processes that you yourself took advantage of?
Yeah, so a couple points. So one, just picking up on the on your question a minute ago. So Congress delegates for different reasons and in different situations. Scholarship suggests that the most common situation in which Congress delegates is when there's united control, right? Control by a single party. House and Senate controlled by the same party that's in the White House. And the reason for this is pretty obvious, right? If Congress, as most political bodies are concerned about the immediate problem they're wrestling with, then it makes a lot of sense that if the majority party in Congress is more or less aligned with the perspective from the White House, they would give a lot more discretion to the agencies that are, at the end of the day, answerable to the White House to sort things out than if someone who's sort of fundamentally at odds with their perspective is in the White House, right? So I think one really important change that Loper-Bright makes is it means that Congress, even when there's united control, can't be too sure who's going to get to interpret ambiguous text. It might mean, if Congress enacts a vague provision, it might be vague enough that there's no standard essentially to apply, and so the agency has, notwithstanding Loper, quite a bit of discretion in implementing the statute. But it might be that there's enough contour to the statute that a court is going to have the decisive say over what the provision means, and what the White House through the agencies would like to do is ruled out of bounds by courts. So I think Loper-Bright makes it harder for in a unitary control scenario for diminishes the incentives for Congress to delegate to the president. Now as to whether I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to construe your question as whether the executive broadly, not just OIRA, can encourage Congress to adopt some of the measures that I'm describing. I think the answer there is unquestionably yes. And to take it even further, I think probably some sort of action by the executive, by the president in particular, is necessary for Congress to revive. The reason for that is this. The most effective way for Congress to reassert legislative control would be for it to require the most important rules to obtain congressional approval ex ante, right? Something kind of like the REINS Act, right? There's no way that something like that will ever pass Congress with veto-proof majorities. So the president, I think, for anything like REINS to ever come into law, the president has to support it. Even then, it might not be enough. But without the president's support, there's just no prospect at all of movement. And I think that's true of any sort of legislative reform designed to re-empower Congress. It's gonna have to have really serious buy-in from the White House.
Further than that, and I do want to get back to your anti-steamboat rhetoric. I grew up on the Mississippi River, and so that really...
It's a death trap. I mean, just ask Jeff Buckley. I mean, it's not good.
But I want to pick up first on what Paul said about the president and Congress. For everything I just said about the importance of Congress reasserting itself, I agree completely. The best Congresses work with a visionary president. And this is one of the constant stories in American history. The most productive Congresses, whether it was the early Congresses with Washington, the first Republican Party with Lincoln, FDR and his New Deal Congresses, all the way through to the Civil Rights era and so on. It always started with the energy of a president who said, this is an issue worth tackling. Here's the broad sort of contours of it, but Congress, you have to make it your own. And then Congress would go with it. When Congress was not all that productive, think about the post-Civil War era with all the bearded presidents who we never could remember what order they were in when we were reciting them in elementary school. Was it Garfield before Chester Arthur? I still don't know.
No one knows.
No one knows.
No one
But
knows.
when you had a president who really wanted to lead and pick an issue, but then trust Congress to actually decide what it would look like specifically, those have been the most successful Congresses. It's not that the president's micromanaging or dictating, but he's choosing the issue that Congress is going to engage on. I think that's very important. But I also think it's important for Congress to have its own ambition. And so my main point,
Adam, sorry, hate to interrupt. Can I just pick up on that point that you just made?
Yeah, please.
I think it's an incredibly important point. So we talk all the time. No, no. Well, I have not much to say in addition to what you just said, which is really great. But I do want to say though, very, very often the terms of the debate is cast as Congress versus the president, and so it's like there's a sum total of power in the system, and the president's been either seizing it from Congress or being given it from Congress, and so Congress, the net result at the end of the day is like, I don't know, President 100, Congress 0, something like that. I think it's all nonsense. I think presidents, to be really powerful, have to be in dialogue with a Congress that can and will hold its own. Right? For many reasons. Adam just sketched a few of them really brilliantly. I'll add one more, which is this. The most visionary president in the world on domestic policy can do basically nothing of lasting consequence without Congress's help. But when presidents have vast reservoirs of discretion, they are massively undermotivated to go to Congress and overmotivated to go it alone, which means that they can get done what they want to get done really quickly, really well. And then whatever they've done, their legacy evaporates on contact with their successor, right? About 1 p.m. on January 20, right? So if they have to go to Congress, they get a little less of what they want, but it lasts. And I think that's what the most visionary presidents want, right? So what I want to say is, actually, it's not just that power shifts from Congress to the president, though it does. Power seeps out of the system in our current arrangement.
You know, when President Obama said early in his term, I think when he was first in office and sort of challenging Congress with Democratic majorities in both houses to legislate on climate policy, he said, if Congress won't act, I will. And at that moment, Congress wasn't actually going to act. And a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate would not actually legislate on climate policy because the president saying he'd go alone just drains all of the system out, all the energy out of the system, all the hydraulic fluid out of the legislative process. And that works across administrations. Folks who have been on the Hill for a long time know how that's happened when a president said, I can go it alone on a border wall or anything else. But I want to back to that point though about ambition. I think it's important to see what's the saying. I try to avoid it. You have to know what's the time, what time it is, something like that. But generationally, I do think it's important to understand what the moment is. That there have been a few moments in American history where the changes in technology and culture have given Congress the opportunity to make lasting change. One of the reasons why working on administrative law is so infuriating is that we have to sit around and constantly talk about the Telecom Act of 96 or the Communications Act of 34 or the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which is like the baby of them all. And
You're really selling it right now.
Yeah, I know. It sounds even more fun than it sounds. Well, the point though is when these landmark laws get passed, they're there for a very long time, decades, a century or more. And the last time we had a real opportunity for a lot of these laws was the Progressive era and then the New Deal hot on its heels. This, with the technological changes at hand, with things like AI and so on, the cultural changes, or even just changes to familiar topics like energy policy and so on, there's a moment where Congress, working with the president, can make sweeping laws that last for a generation or more. And maybe what it takes to restore that ambition in Congress is just to put legislators' names back on the bills, to really give them a stake in it. I don't know what it takes, but there's a moment here for if a member has an issue that he or she cares about, it's not just that they can legislate on it, but they can legislate on it for something that will last decades. And anything that we can do to stir up or awaken that ambition in members of Congress, for the ones who really do want to do that. And I know there's all different kinds of members of Congress, and they play all different roles in the legislative process and in oversight. But for the ones who really want to legislate and legislate for an era, this is a moment that might not come again for a very long time. Not just the fact of political environments changing and aligning, but the fact that the technological and cultural questions at hand are staggeringly new and open at this moment in a way that might not seem as energized and as fresh 10 or 25 years from now. I think some Congress is going to capitalize on it. I hope it's a Congress that I like, because I'd hate to spent the rest of my career having spent the first half talking about progressive and New Deal era statutes. I really don't want to talk the rest of my career about a bunch of laws that AOC signed into law that sort of set the frameworks for all these issues. I hope this Congress and the next Congresses are ambitious.
Well, I would just point out that Adam's pro-steamboat screed was not forthcoming, so I appreciate that.
Can I just say one
We got to
last thing?
control the steamboats, Adam.
So I talk about this in my administrative law class. I always point out that in the 1850s, steamboats were great at two things: moving things and people and blowing up. And when Congress went to actually, they said it was the first sort of modern regulatory commission. It's interesting that they didn't just delegate it all to the executive branch. They tried to come up with something that would act kind of like a court. They knew that the executive branch was the worst possible place to make policy. A generation before that, when they were doing things like the Bank of the United States, they didn't say, let's just let the Treasury Department do all this. They said, let's create a kind of semi-public-private corporation that would have some government people on it, but not completely. And it to this day makes my colleague Jay Cost's head explode that they did that kind of thing. But the fact is, it took us a century and a half to say, let's just let the executive branch do it. And so that's less than half of our country's history ago. The idea of letting the executive branch, let alone the courts or these quasi-governmental bodies, make policy really was the last option. And it turns out it might have been the worst option of all in many ways. And hopefully we can learn from that history. I'm so excited about this generational turning point because thanks to folks like Philip Hamburger and a number of the justices, they're not just changing the doctrines, they're really reopening the narratives about what the last century was about. And so we have a chance going forward not just to make better laws, but to have a better understanding of what we just went through and what Congress is capable of.
And so with that, I thought we would open it up for some questions. We already got a lot of questions here, so we'll do a couple questions here.
Yeah, hi. I really like what I'm hearing here. I'm Augustus Alzona. I've been in this town since 1955. I like that thing about, I don't know if it was a Mickey Mouse Steamboat Willie you were referring to, but anyway, I'm saying here, welcome to the land of Oz, because it's been sort of that way, at least since I've been here. Here's a basic question, and whoever of you would like to answer this question. Going back in history, and hopefully this is not a revisionist view question or anything, but and in light of the fact that we are on the verge 10 days from now, we will be commemorating, celebrating, whatever, the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution, April 19th. And I see kind of like good or bad, maybe we are actually in the Second American Revolution. That being said, here's the question, whichever of you wants to answer this. Going back to post-President Lincoln, which one of the dead presidents, so that doesn't include the ones who are still alive in this town, was your favorite in terms of your worldview of the so-called administrative state?
So I'm going to cheat and answer your question and also speak to your prologue. The reason I jumped to go first is I just want to say Reagan because I think it's easy, but probably easy for you guys too. So I had to get there first and leave you with the hard work. But to speak to your prologue, I do want to say, while I agree absolutely with what everyone said tonight about this being kind of a moment of tremendous potential, I also want to highlight why. Well, there's a number of reasons, but one reason in particular I want to say I do think there's something that makes this moment extremely different from the founding era, and I don't know how many of you have read Hannah Arendt on Revolution. She has a tremendous account, I think, of the American Revolution, and her argument is that at the time of the Revolution and then at the time of the making of the Constitution, America was characterized by a profound space in which deliberation was possible. In fact, if you read both Federalist and Anti-Federalist essays, what you find is that everyone is shouting to each other, don't move too fast. Take it slow. Think it through, right? Whereas you find in other revolutions claims about the irresistible will of the people in the tide of history. I think that kind of business would have been just appalling to, I think, every American who would have said the most important thing about our moment is that by providence or human ingenuity or just blind chance, we have a chance to decide something. We're not subject to the sort of ordinary compulsive forces that characterize day in, day out politics. We have a wider freedom of choice so we can make better decisions that give us greater freedom in the long term. I will say, I think the sort of forces of political compulsion are super high right now. There's a lot of action and reaction. People are making decisions really fast. They're not saying slow down, they're saying speed up. That distinguishes, and not, as you may have inferred, in a good way, our moment from that moment.
If I would answer that very briefly, I may give an answer that's surprising, and it's Gerald Ford. much of the deregulatory activity that Mr. Carter and then later Mr. Reagan were able to take some credit for was instigated during the Ford presidency. And the way that it was carried out was also a bipartisan enterprise, and it was a very thoughtful enterprise. It wasn't simply anti-regulatory pique. It was a looking at agencies and saying, are we still at that point in America where we need a civil aeronautics board? Or has the economy developed in a certain way that we don't need these training wheels or whatever you want to describe it as? Do we still need an ICC? Do we still need this? Certainly Mr. Ford had his own suspicions. He was a Main Street Republican sort of guy, but he was anti-regulatory. He wasn't like, Tom DeLay, who once referred to the Code of Federal Regulations as like a patch-eyed pirate or something like that. Gerald Ford didn't get a whole lot of props, but I think a lot of really thoughtful regulatory reform started during his administration, and it was done in conjunction with Congress. It was not unilateralism, which critically gave it a chance to endure.
And I'll just say briefly, I'll start with Reagan because, of course, Reagan, but second because when he came to office and he wanted to reform regulation and push back against overregulation, what did he do? He built OIRA. And I like it not just because it gave Paul a job later, but also because I think it's important to understand that it's not just about deconstructing things. You also have to construct new institutions that are built for their time and their moment to actually serve a purpose and embody the principles that you want to see in government. So Reagan for that, but also for reasons that I alluded to earlier. You look at the challenge that faced Eisenhower when he came to office, an entirely new world order, new technological questions about things like nuclear power and so on, a different country in the aftermath of World War II. And he helped to rise to the occasion and help build institutions and pass laws that were suited for the moment, that drew from things like science and so on, but at the end of his administration would warn about not just a military-industrial complex, but I think he actually said a military-industrial scientific complex. He understood that government needed to learn from these things, but remain firmly representative of the people, and I think Eisenhower embodied that.
Thank you. My question's for both Kevin and Adam. You both have spoken about how possibly the problem with Congress right now is that it's either understaffed or it needs more things like a congressional regulatory agency or something like that. I would like you both to steelman the other side, pointing to Adam's recanting of the Congresses that have been very effective. They were at a time where there weren't many congressional staff. Congressmen and members did a lot of the legislating themselves. They had maybe a secretary and maybe one or two staffers. Can you steelman the side of there are too many congressional staffers and it incentivizes Congress to not actually do anything?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. In the early, give me a little timeline here. Early 70s, Congress was tired of being pushed around. Mr. Nixon, Mr. Johnson, going back a bit. We had very aggressive executives who were, deploying the power of the newly created executive agencies. Congress said, okay, wait a minute, early 70s, we're going to build ourselves back up. Congressional Budget Act, a whole bunch of other things to build capacity. And one of the things they did was to add more staff, both committee staff and personal staff. And the kind of add more water approach, it was helpful, but it also created basic management problems. And so by 1980, you had scholars like Michael Malbin who were doing case studies on the Hill, walking around talking to people. And you had legislators going, I'm trying to get a meeting with this other member of the Congress, and I can't get through his staff. Like, who's running this place? And then, staff government became a term. So there was this basic problem of like, how do we digest all these people that we put into here and keep them from, running the asylum? And there was a pause in hiring. And, the average member of the House has the same number of staff as since 1980. But of course, we're now in a funny position where more of those staff, because of the growing number of constituents, we're up to about an average number of 740,000 constituents per House member. Never mind what the Senate's math is. It's even more mind-boggling. More and more of the personal staff are being devoted to constituent services, communications, these sorts of stuff, and not directed toward policy. So we're not in a situation where an individual member of Congress has like a lot of people that they can just cast off policy to and not have to think about it, and that's made them lazy. Policy, the number of areas of policy where you can lean into just keeps growing and growing. And this is partially Congress's fault because it legislates the executive branch by aggregation. Like, oh, why don't we have a new program to help people who are transitioning out of the military and who need help getting new job training, blah, blah, blah. We'll stand up a new program, a little bureau inside Department of Labor or wherever the hell it may be. There are 5 other agencies already doing that. But a member wants to do it to be able to claim credit and whatever else, and they think those other ones don't work. So you just keep aggregating. So the policy realm is just going to keep growing and growing and growing unless you have presidents wielding veto. That keeps going. Meanwhile, staff numbers have stayed the same since the early 80s. Committee members in the House, staffers, it's gone down since the early 80s. So that delta is not a pleasant delta to look at. So I don't really feel that members are incentivized to be lazy, and that if they just leaned in to the 35 policy areas that they should be paying attention to, they would. But I do think that to some degree, if you want, again, it gets back to my comment, if you want something to get done, you have to assign somebody to do it. And the average voter does not assign members of Congress to work on very discrete issues, particularly regulatory ones, in which case they don't do it.
The only thing worse than an academic telling Congress how to do its job is a lawyer telling Congress how to do its job, and I've been both. So I don't know that Congress needs more staff. I know my humble opinion is I hope it will have more ambition for the legislative moment, and to the extent that you're able to draw resources from administration or from others, they don't have to work in Congress, but they should be doing their job that they originally created for, which was to be an aid to Congress. If they can improve that process, great. And if you have to look for resources beyond the administration, great. But for me, the first thing is the mission, and then the second thing is how do you staff it accordingly.
So nice to see one more question. One more.
You're right that the executive has a lot of experience, but to me, that's the problem. When the agency comes in with a lot of preconceived biases, it's very hard for them to change their mind when they're wrong. And to me, what a lot of agencies do in the rules is specify certain facts about the world. And I would trust 12 random people picked out of the phone book when presented with experts on both sides of the issue to be able to kind of decide what the true facts are. So regulation through things like negligence and courts as common law and civil litigation is at least some way I would think should be considered an alternative as well. What are your thoughts on that alternative?
Pardon me. I'd say, you can learn important things from experience. You can learn important things from not having experience, from being sort of above it all and being able to weigh different accounts given from different perspectives dispassionately, right? So I think both are important. That's why I think the solution is to give Congress the benefit of the agency's experience, but not make the agency's experience kind of dispositive, as I think you're suggesting.
Yeah, I would just only add on to that. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about human beings. And now that I'm 55 years old, I know I'm certainly set in some of my ways. I've got habits. There's things that I want to do, both large and small in my life on a daily basis, and I really don't like to have my cheese moved. And the same thing is true for people who work within agencies. And guess what? They're surrounded by people who very frequently are of the same mind. So there's a kind of sociology of knowledge, like, yes, these guys are all really smart, but they're also kind of incubated in their own personal spaces. And meanwhile, you've got this great swirl of a country around them with hundreds of millions of people and all sorts of other values. And whether those things are seeping into there, to say nothing of the scientific discoveries and all that sort of stuff, I get back to yes, there's a tremendous amount of expertise there, but expertise is not everything. It's not going to get us all the way there. And expertise, I mean, I don't know. It was a funny William F. Buckley quip 70 years ago or something like that. He'd rather be ruled by the first 100 people in the phone book than the faculty at Harvard. And it's well, yeah, there's an element of truth to that, because birds of a feather flock together, and they kind of create their own little realm of what is acceptable knowledge, what is right, what is true, what are values hierarchies. Of course, this happens within agencies. And Congress is a completely different thing because you always got new people flowing in and out of it. And that makes it much more amateur, but it also makes it probably a little less likely to be kind of caught in that tight-bound way of thinking about stuff.
I always thought the Buckley quote was strange. Like, he wanted us to be governed by 100 people whose last name started with A. Like, what do they know?
Well, also, America doesn't have rulers.
Your point's a good one, that not every issue needs to be decided at the federal level, and not every issue decided at the state level needs to be decided in advance with legislation. And there is something to be said for allowing some things to just be handled by tort law and so on. So if we're going to put more emphasis on juries, I understand it. And I also will think of you, and I hope everybody thinks of you, the next time we're summoned for jury duty. We'll say, oh, thanks, great, we're doing our duty. But that's all I have to say.
Yeah, well, I would just ask everyone to give a round of applause to our panelists here.